How's this go? Oh, am I live? Am I live? Yes, I am. Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be discussing a pretty serious thing, Saudi Arabia's Pensacola attack, and why I believe it to be worse than terrorism. If you're new to this, if you're new to this kind of programming, let me just run you through what it's going to be like. We will be doing a quick presentation, sort of 45 minutes, half hour, something like that. And then I'll do Q&A after that. You may notice that there is a discussion, a place where folks can discuss things to the right that I'm already finding a little bit distracting. I'm noticing somewhat trolly behavior from Donald Trump, appropriately enough. If he keeps it up, I'll just block him. Anyway, so we will do a quick presentation, then we'll do Q&A afterwards. You can ask me questions during the presentation, but I won't see them. So if you can just ask your questions again when we get to the Q&A portion, then I'll be able to respond, and that would be great. Yeah, so I guess here we go. Also, please, I've noticed I've already violated this policy, but please be civil to each other. I find Donald Trump he's got me. I've fed the troll. That guy in the comments is very good at getting my goat, and he has gotten my goat. But I would please ask that you be more civil to everybody else than I have been thus far. Feel free to be as negative about me and my ideas as you want to be. Just don't lay into each other too much. All right, let's get into it. Now, this is interesting. Folks who've been watching for a while will notice that this is the first time I've covered an attack in like 4 years. I've got a pretty established policy now where I don't really talk about mass shootings or individual acts of terrorism. I think if you go back to like 2015, 2016, you can see numerous videos that respond directly to attacks or what I think about these attacks. But I sort of decided that I stopped doing that because eventually it became pretty clear that I was participating in what the killers wanted. You know, I was giving them a spotlight and giving them more power by talking about them and using their events, the horrible things they did as a launching pad for content or discussion. It simply wasn't the appropriate thing for me to do. So I stopped doing that. But the thing is, with this Pensacola attack that happened on Friday, we're not actually dealing with, we are dealing with a mass shooting, we are dealing with terrorism, but it's also much more than that. The significance of the Pensacola attack is not as mass shooting or terrorism, it is as a diplomatic incident, a massive, what should be an extraordinarily significant diplomatic incident. And what I'm mostly going to be complaining about today is the fact that it's being described as if it's just another act of terrorism or just another mass shooting. So what happened was this, if you've already tuned this out so much that you're not aware of it, on Friday morning at, I believe it's the Pensacola Naval Station, I should have probably had the exact details for that, there was a shooting. There was a Saudi officer. This is an officer in the Saudi Arabian military, a member of the Saudi Air Force. That's really important and sort of the key thing to what we're discussing today that a lot of people just seem to be kind of forgetting or wiping away. This was a member of the Saudi military, a representative of Saudi Arabia, officially, straightforwardly, completely, a Saudi Arabian military officer, not, an enlisted person, not, this was an officer, a privileged elite person in Saudi Arabian society and Saudi Arabian military, murdered 3 U.S. sailors. I believe they were all in flight training. There is a longstanding programming in the U.S. military where they train Saudi military professionals, and Saudi pilots are chief among that. So in a class, I believe it was around 6:30 in the morning, They were meeting, and this guy just hauled off and started shooting people. It took about 4 minutes before local law enforcement got in there and killed him. But before that happened, he managed to kill three young U.S. sailors. I believe they would have all been officers as well. So yeah, they were like aged 19, 20, 21, 22. So just from the very get-go, there's been a sort of storm of obfuscation about what actually happened here. You can find both. You can find the sort of full public relations push from Saudi Arabia, from their ambassadors, from their king, all over Twitter, and through, of course, their most expensive and chief supporter, the highest value supporter, Donald Trump, was putting forward this, oh, he doesn't represent us. This guy who killed these folks doesn't really represent us. What you should think about is you should think about those Saudi students back in 2018 who died to save young Christian boys or something along those lines. This is the sort of thing you would see on Twitter that day on Friday, just instantly a full court press from the Saudi government, from Twitter, from the president of the United States, talking about, oh, this doesn't really represent Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is so broken up about this, feels so terrible about this. This isn't about us. And that's just wrong. This was a Saudi military officer who killed U.S. soldiers on a U.S. base on U.S. soil. Now, I think if you watch this channel, you know that I have a certain antipathy to Saudi Arabia. I'm not a big fan of Saudi Arabia generally. I mean, the Saudi people have, their benefits, and there's the same amount of potential and goodness in Saudi Arabia as there is in any other country. However, their government is a deeply dysfunctional disaster that is responsible for many of the problems that we've seen in the world over the past 20 years. So I am against the Saudi government. I'd love to use this as an excuse to, punish them massively. I don't think that necessarily has to be what happens, but there needs to be a broader discussion than what we've been getting. It's really frustrating just how little discussion this Pensacola thing is getting from this angle. It, of course, it's a shooting, so we sort of seem to be trotting out the same approaches, the same arguments, the same discussions that we trot out for every discussion. And yeah, the fact that Saudi Arabia is involved is mentioned in a small way, but it's also mentioned in ways that are similar to other attacks. And it's not. I mean, this is the Saudi military killing U.S. military figures on U.S. ground. This is a fundamentally different thing. So I think I'm just going to run through a number of the things that they've been choosing to discuss in U.S. and U.S. media, and from government investigations, like what they're choosing to discuss, and why I just don't think it quite encapsulates what we should be looking at here. So Donald Trump has been a real focus of this, and I think that's true, and it was certainly my first instinct as well. This shooting happened at 6:30 a.m. or thereabouts. It was between 6 and 7 in the morning in Florida, and by 2:18 p.m., that's when his first tweet came out. Donald Trump was tweeting about King Salman's lengthy phone call and how King Salman, finds this terrible and regretful, and how people in Saudi Arabia are just brokenhearted that this happened. And how King Salman was talking about how this doesn't represent us. So, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating, of course, that Donald Trump is so bought out by the Saudis that he's going to, act in such a sniveling, cowardly way. But this isn't new information. This is stuff we already knew, from the way that he's covered up for MBS over the killing of Khashoggi, the way that he has allowed the savage destruction of Yemen to continue. This is not news. This is not particularly surprising. What's going on is that I believe both U.S. media and U.S. government are finding sort of strategies to to talk about this without talking about what's really important here. The fact that they want to avoid talking about the fact that Saudi Arabia essentially attacked the United States on Friday. So they're talking about anything else. And Trump is one of, even though this is a very valid point and worth bringing up, Trump's incredible corruption and the fact that the Saudis own Trump, that's worth bringing up. But it's also being used as a distraction. Another kind of meaningless distraction here is it terrorism? Gosh, I don't know. And so there's a small window here where people will care about a given event. We're already outside of this window. If I had done this live chat on Saturday, I think rather than having 70 people watching right now, I'd have probably had 400 or 500 people watching right now, because people really cared on Saturday about Pensacola and what was happening. So there's like they call it the news cycle, the 24-hour news cycle, or, so Pensacola was important. On Saturday, it was important on Sunday. By Monday, oh, there's new stuff to talk about. And by Tuesday, it's like it's already been forgotten. And one of the ways to shield the Saudi government is by wasting the time of those first crucial 2 days talking about stuff that doesn't really matter. Like the Trump thing, like is it terrorism? Is it not terrorism? And this wasn't just the media. US officials were complicit in this as well. On the day of, I make a lot of fun of right-wing media, or old people's media, as I call it. And I generally find them to be quite loony. But I got to say, on this topic, a lot of media figures that I really don't like have been pretty good. From Tucker Carlson to who's the guy who likes killing brown people for Fox, the POW guy on Fox, Pete Hegseth or something, to who else? Mike Cernovich. These people, I mean, it's been out there from the morning of the shooting that this guy deeply believes in, deeply held Saudi ideology about the evils of the United States. I mean, he's a guy who's committed to the way that Saudi Arabia has always looked at things, the way that it has always taught its people. We've known this, so it was pretty clear from the get-go why this guy did this stuff. He left a manifesto. It's very straightforward, but because it was involving Saudi Arabia and it was involving the Saudi military, well, the folks on the ground, they had to hem and haw about it. They had, I don't know, is this terrorism? Is this not terrorism? You got this, I believe, from local law enforcement and from federal law enforcement. So this isn't just a media thing. This is actively, it's insane that these folks had to wait 72 hours before they could say conclusively that this guy was before they could say conclusively that this guy was a terrorist or whatever. But that's not even really that important sorry. And to close it off, by this morning, Tuesday morning, or rather it was Monday evening, 72 hours after people stopped paying attention or stopped caring, yeah, the officials were conceding, of course it's terrorism, or according to our definition of terrorism or what have you. So it was sort of a nowhere thing for officials to talk about and for media to talk about, and sort of waste time until people stopped paying attention. I said that, it's true. A lot of people in media that I don't like, sort of, loonier towards the fringes, right-wing types, and of course, Fox News types who are pretty loony and towards the fringe, have been getting this right and have been talking about Saudi Arabia and have been trying to keep this Pensacola thing in the headlines, as it should be, because it's insane. But you can already see, even with those folks who are beginning to get it right, it's becoming about Islam rather than Saudi Arabia, which is obviously the classic distraction. I did a whole series of videos and wrote a short book called Everybody's Lying About Islam that takes that as its central thing. Democrats, Republicans, nobody wants to actually talk about Saudi Arabia because they get a lot of money from it. So just sort of naturally, people start skewing towards talking about Islam. We don't talk about how 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudi Arabians working for a Saudi Arabian in service to Saudi Arabian ideology. No, no, it's Islam we need to worry about. And the right wing figures who had initially gotten this Pensacola story right are forgetting about Saudi Arabia. Now it's Islam again, which is standard. It's what they do. You know, it's sort of how that happens, unfortunately. Another completely meaningless bullshit thing. Oh yeah. So terrorism. Is this terrorism? Is this not terrorism? You know, terrorism is, especially since the oil prices have been going down, terrorism is something that's done by weird loners, you know, done by crazy people, sad, crazy people. And the significance of is this or is this not terrorism is pales in comparison. That's the title of this video. You know, Saudi Arabia's Pensacola attack is worse than terrorism. This is because of this asshole's status as an officer in the Saudi Arabian Air Force. He is, as a second lieutenant, I believe, he is a representative of Saudi Arabia. So that makes this a sort of state on state action. This makes it's much more significant than whether or not some loner, decided to blow himself up and shoot some people. Okay, so that's the sort of right wing terrorism, whining about Islam narrative. The other thing is the gun control narrative. One of my senators, I'm resident in Connecticut still, Dick Blumenthal or Richard Blumenthal, or whatever, was tweeting about, we have to know how this guy got a gun. And it's just like, what? I mean, look, it's fucking Florida, okay? It's a right-leaning state with the standard American crazy gun laws. Who gives a fuck about how he got a gun? This is another one of those ways to waste time until everybody forgets about this. So there was some hunting license exception that allowed him to get a gun as a foreign national, whatever, he bought it legally. But it's like, I think on Twitter yesterday, I compared like worrying about gun control here is like, it's sort of like, and don't get me wrong, I think gun control is a perfectly valid thing to discuss. And in the context of mass shootings, sure, talk about it all the time. But talking about gun control in this instance is like trying to straighten the rug while your house is burning down. I just found that really infuriating because, it's my fucking senator. My other senator, Chris Murphy, is generally tends to be one of the better senators on foreign policy, is asking serious questions about Saudi Arabia and Pensacola, and he's also been really good on Yemen. It's a weird thing. He's also really bad on other things. He's a U.S. senator, but he's actually pretty good on a lot of these issues, worth mentioning. But yes, so I mean, this sort of, is it terrorism? Is it not terrorism? Are we dealing with gun control? Are we, and even honestly, like focusing on the shamefulness, the sniveling gutlessness of Donald Trump to be talking, 8 hours after the shooting, to be doing public relations work for Saudi Arabia. Even that is a distraction from, holy cow, a Saudi Arabian officer murdered a bunch of U.S. soldiers on a U.S. base. Yeah, so like this should be so much bigger than Khashoggi. I mean, this happened in the United States. This wasn't a writer for the Washington Post. This was 3 U.S. soldiers in educational classes in furtherance of their active duty. This Saudi Arabian officer who murdered them, was there in pursuance of his duty as a representative of the Saudi Arabian military, Saudi Arabian country. This should be a much bigger thing than Khashoggi. Now, of course, this shouldn't be a bigger thing than 9/11 because of the sheer body count and destructiveness and significance of 9/11. But this should actually be harder for the Saudi Arabian government to explain away than 9/11. The 15 of 19 hijackers that were Saudi that flew those planes into those buildings, well, that's a separate issue. They were supported by the Saudi government. That's not even really disputed anymore, by aspects of the Saudi royal family and the royal government. The extent to which that was intentionally done, as a policy by the Saudi government, that's disputable. But the 9/11 hijackers were supported by members of the royal family. Anyway, that's a completely different issue. But That exactly, that's a debatable issue. That's something you have to investigate and find stuff out about. This guy, again, is a member of the Saudi military, sent here by the Saudi government in furtherance of the Saudi government's goals and plans. This guy was here in his official capacity. There is no question about whether or not he represented Saudi Arabia. He absolutely represented Saudi. Now I may be seeming a little vehement here, because I think, but I think vehemence is warranted. This is something I'm pretty pissed off about. Um, but I don't, and as I think I said earlier briefly, like while I do believe that there we the program to train Saudi pilots should be ended because of this, I believe that it should have been ended on Thursday as well. But so I don't know if my exact policy prescriptions are something that has to be that should be adopted, but people should be paying more attention to this, even if we just take a bigger bribe from the Saudis or something like that. Like people have to be paying attention here. So the appropriate, I don't believe they will, but people should be paying more attention here. So the appropriate comparison here is not the Orlando shooting, or the San Bernardino shooting, or any mass shooting or act of terrorism in the United States. It's not Orlando or any other mass shooting or act of terrorism. The appropriate comparison here is to talk about not Orlando, but Okinawa. I'm specifically talking about the U.S. military bases in Okinawa. It's Okinawa specifically that I'm going to talk about today because it's become very controversial. But this is an issue that comes up with U.S. bases everywhere. That comes with military bases. Just comes with military bases everywhere. When you've got military bases with a lot of young men together, a lot of young men who are trained towards violence together, really bad things happen. It's become the biggest international incident around Okinawa, the biggest diplomatic problem for the United States around our bases in Okinawa, which is a prefecture of Japan. It was taken during World War II by the United States. And I believe I didn't realize this until I was researching this, but it was occupied until 1972. And there are massive U.S. military installations on Okinawa. It's sort of probably some of the most important bases for the United States in Asia. And the soldiers there have committed some pretty horrible crimes. The figures are since 1972, 741 serious crimes, 129 rapes, and 26 murders committed by U.S. personnel there. And there's some really horrific stuff reading about this. Back in 1995, there was just a really nasty gang rape and murder of a child, and there was a horrific rape and murder as recently as 2016. I mean, so 741 serious crimes. I mean, some of this is just killing somebody through drunken driving, or some of them are thefts or what have you. Anyway, there's a range of horrible stuff that has happened because of the U.S. base in Okinawa. The U.S. base is in Okinawa. Now, when something horrible happens, nobody in the U.S. government would be shameless or idiotic enough to go, "Oh, those guys don't represent us. Those guys don't represent us." The appropriate attitude is, "Oh my God, this is horrible. They are U.S. soldiers. Of course they represent us. And how do we make this right?" That is the attitude that Saudi Arabia should be putting forward right now. And that is not the attitude that we're seeing. It's interesting, in the 1990s, I believe this became a very, very big thing for some geopolitical reasons that we'll get to later. Also in 1995, there was a particularly horrifying crime, the details of which I will not burden you with. But in Okinawa, it became a huge issue in the 1990s, and is still an ongoing issue today. And what's important to focus on here is that the U.S. government took steps to satisfy the concerns of the Japanese people. There were huge changes that were made. Apparently, alcohol is banned for U.S. service people in Okinawa. I mean, that's something that happens in very strict Muslim countries. That is not, I mean, there's a lot of drinking in Japan, I understand. So alcohol was banned. My understanding is that there's been some, I don't have the details in front of me, but my understanding is that there have been big changes, like bases are being moved further away from population centers. And it's an ongoing, serious political issue in Japan, in the United States. It is an ongoing diplomatic issue in the relationship between Japan and the United States. This is serious stuff. There have been serious consequences. And the fact that it now looks like, I think, 3 days out, it seems very likely that this Pensacola thing is just going to, sort of flutter away, and Donald Trump, is going to cover for him, and not just Donald Trump is going to cover for him, but Democratic senators by whining about gun control until the issue goes away, or even right-wing supposed soldiers against the jihadists are going to just whine about Islam until this goes away. And you better freaking believe that after some U.S. service people murdered a child in Okinawa, you gotta believe that the fucking Japanese prime minister wasn't doing public relations work for the U.S. government 8 hours later. So yeah. Even though we shouldn't be focusing on Trump's craven bootlicking here, it still really bugs me. So that's the comparison here. It's not Orlando, it's Okinawa. Like, if your military professional overseas murders people, it's obviously the responsibility of your government. It is obviously a representation of your country. And it's very anger making to hear the Saudi Arabians try to avoid that responsibility. And it's infuriating to see US politicians and media figures and government officials back that decision up. That's pretty offensive. So what I think we should be thinking about, if we had a sane government right now, what we would be looking at is what the consequences are for the program of educating Saudi pilots, what the consequences are for the program of, for the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Obviously, I think this is something that should have changed dramatically a long time ago. But even folks who are big fans of Saudi Arabia and enjoy getting money out of them should be looking at this as an opportunity to get more money out of them. Should be looking at this as a way to change the details of the relationship. This would be a great counterweight, and I suppose it is quite terrible of me to speak about using these murders as a bargaining chip, but that's what they are. These murders are a bargaining chip in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. That's the way they should be used, because that's the way the world works. There should be consequences for Saudi Arabia for sending this officer that murdered our soldiers. So that's, obviously, I think this program should be binned. I think that there need to be serious changes between U.S. and Saudi governments. But even the big fans of Saudi Arabia should be using this to change the terms of the relationship, even if it is just scholarships and all these kids' names and slight changes to the way we're handling the Saudi destruction of Yemen. Like, yeah, this should be a bargaining chip. It should not just be sort of frittered away. One last aspect on this before we get to Q&A. Obviously, there's a real difference here. So I've made this comparison between what happened on Friday and U.S. murders of Japanese civilians in Okinawa. But what's key here is that there's a very serious power imbalance, and very different in those two examples. the host country is getting some very different things out of the guest country that did some murders. Um, Japan, it's interesting. There was a horrific crime in the 90s, but you know what? It's quite possible there were horrific crimes in other eras that did get covered up. In the 1990s, it was a weird moment where the U.S. presence in Okinawa looked kind of vulnerable because this isn't something that's remembered, but the Japanese had a tremendously bad relationship with the Soviet Union. They had a bad relationship with Russia, the bad relationship with the Soviet Union. So one of the reasons people always wonder why, this is a side note, people always wonder why, gosh, the occupations of Germany and Japan went so well. Why hasn't the United States been able to occupy anybody since? Well, the Japanese and German occupations after World War II went well because there was a massive threat. There was a massive threat from the Soviet Union that sort of instantly came into play. And that set the relationship in a way that allowed the occupation to be successful. So from the late 1940s until the early 1990s, the U.S. presence in Japan, it's currently at around 50,000 soldiers. Back then, it was probably much higher, protected Japan from the Soviet Union. After the 1990s, in the 2000s and the 2010s, U.S. forces there are there to protect Japan from China, and that's not a problem that's going away. So we've got we provide real value to the Japanese. It's debatable, of course. It's, people go back and forth on it, but fundamentally, our forces are there to protect them from China. What exactly does teaching Saudis how to fly planes protect us from? I mean, let's be honest, fundamentally, this guy was learning how to kill Yemeni children. That's why he was here. That's the main function of the Saudi Air Force right now, is killing women and children in Yemen, a weak country next to Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia has invaded. And it's also incredibly morally fraught and condemnable that the United States is involved in supporting them. So this guy was training to kill Yemeni women and children, and instead he shot a bunch of U.S. soldiers. So yeah, there's not a lot of real purpose here. The purpose is to sell weaponry, and this is really good for a couple corporations and the stock owners, the folks who own stock in those corporations. I would argue it's not frickin' worth it, but that's something to sort of countervail this idea that Okinawa and Pensacola are comparable. Another issue here is just the folks who is the quantity. So in Okinawa, I didn't break out the figures for Okinawa specifically, but in Japan writ large, there are 50,000 U.S. soldiers. I think back during the Cold War, it was probably significantly more. So that's 50,000 soldiers, that's officers, that's enlisted. Includes a lot of enlisted folks. In the U.S., we sort of consciously use our military as a form of social mobility. So a lot of enlisted folks might have come from rough backgrounds. And that, I think, is a factor. I don't want to, maybe that was classist or racist, I don't know. But that's a factor in the fact that horrible crimes are committed. There's just a very broad population of people, and there's a lot of people on these U.S. bases. So yeah, 700 horrible crimes over 40 years committed by 50,000 odd people from all walks of life in the United States. It's bad. It's absolutely bad. The Japanese government is completely within its rights to complain about it. But it's not, that significant. It's not surprising that level of criminality in that that kind of time frame with that many people. There are apparently, this is a figure, I think there's about 500 Saudi pilots being trained in the United States at any given time on a 4-year stint. Again, these are officers, these are privileged members of Saudi society and the Saudi military. That's generally officers that fly planes. In that 500, maybe there's some ground crew being trained as well. I mean, there'd have to be. Or perhaps they just use U.S. contractors. Um, yeah, 500 people, and they've managed to kill these people. And again, like this isn't somebody got drunk and did something horrible. This guy consciously decided that what he needed to do was go to a morning class and shoot it up. Um, that's Saudi Arabia. That absolutely represents Saudi Arabia. And Yeah, I think this program of training Saudi pilots should stop immediately. I think our endorsement and support of the Saudi Arabia's destruction of Yemen should stop immediately. Um, that's what I believe should be the reaction to this Pensacola thing. But again, like even if you're a big fan of the Saudi relationship, this should be focused on. This should be more attention should be paid, and I don't think it's going to happen. So I did my part. I tried to focus on it. So questions. What do we got? Do people have questions for me? It is question time. Oh boy, I see that we've, thanks to Donald Trump, who I don't like much, we've been talking about the Jews for 30 minutes, 30, 40 minutes. That's always fun. CG Rue says 500 Saudi pilots in training equates to 500 9/11s. I don't think that's entirely true, but interesting. Logo Cool Extreme asks, why was there more outrage at the death of Khashoggi than this? That's a very interesting question. I think probably Khashoggi was better connected than these three kids, who were murdered. I think that's definitely true. One of the weird things about Khashoggi is that he, went to dinner parties with all the media elites that were so scandalized about the fact that he was killed. Also, a really key part here is that the Turkish government was very interested. Remember, Khashoggi was killed in. That's actually really excellent case study. So Khashoggi was killed in a consulate in Istanbul, and it was the Turkish government and the Turkish security services or intelligence services that had all the information about this horrible murder of Khashoggi. And they had it on like day one. They knew, I can't remember, I think they had recordings of the death. They had details about the fact that they had a body double, how many people came in to do this. But the case study here is how, if a government, not even necessarily the United States, because I'm sure the United States government would have been happy to let this go, but if any government in the world that is savvy about how to manage news cycles, they can make an issue happen. And the Turkish government was interested in making Khashoggi happen as an issue. So whereas with Pensacola, you've got, whether consciously or not, you've got a bunch of folks who just want this issue to go away as soon as possible. They come out, they either don't tell you some things at all, or they sort of get all the nasty stuff out at the beginning and rely on the fact that 24 hours, 72 hours later, they're going to forget about it. What the Turkish government did with Khashoggi that was very different was they carefully dribbed and drabbed out the stuff. First we heard, oh, he disappeared at the Saudi consulate in Turkey. What could that have been about? Where is he? And the Turkish government was mercilessly clever about sort of slowly leaking out more and more damning details over the course of months, and letting the Saudi government lie about it at every step. So, they would release something, the Saudi government would lie about it, and then the Turkish government would release something else that made it look obvious that they were lying. So the reason Khashoggi was a bigger thing was because it was a carefully managed scandal, created and managed by the Turkish government. And I'm grateful to them for that, frankly. I think that they did some good work there, because the U.S.-Saudi relationship is a tremendous menace. So yeah. Questions. Oh, wow. RF Hor asks, what is your opinion on Hezbollah? Thoughts on their interference in the Lebanese revolution right now? If you know anything about that. and the Lebanon-Israel situation in general. I do not have. I'm beginning to think. I really don't know what my next topic will be. There's a possibility. So I just recently published a book called Avoiding the British Empire. There's a link in the description. Y'all should buy it. But I don't know what my next big project would be. It is a possibility that my next big project could finally be diving in on Israel. And were I to do that, then I would dive in on Hezbollah. My thoughts on Hezbollah are kind of like poorly formed. I think Hezbollah's influence in the Lebanese government is obviously regrettable. Of course, the reason Hezbollah exists is because of Israeli aggression back in the 80s, 90s through. I mean, I don't think the Israelis actually withdrew from Lebanon until like 2000 or something like that. So yeah, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. I think that's a fair description. That's what my government calls them, and I agree with that. But there's gradations of terrorist organizations. You know, there's your Al Qaeda's and your ISIS's that really have no purpose other than death and destruction. Hamas is a real government, but I think generally has a much more indiscriminate approach to attacking Israel that ends up serving the Palestinians really poorly. That makes them, sort of in between Hezbollah and Al Qaeda. And Hezbollah, yeah, they occasionally send missiles in and they, create problems by kidnapping Israeli soldiers and whatnot. But generally, Hezbollah, my understanding is that Hezbollah is a real military organization that goes toe to toe with the IDF. So obviously, I don't like Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. I don't like the fact that they kill people and create problems. But generally, obviously, I'm less concerned about Hezbollah than I am about Hamas, and I'm less concerned about Hezbollah and Hamas than I am about Al Qaeda and ISIS. That should be a really straightforward thing to say, but I think the level of discourse in the United States is so stupid that even saying that would be seen as, oh, you're defending Hezbollah, you fucking anti-Semite, or you're defending terrorism or whatever. I don't know. So those are my really poorly formed views on Hezbollah. I saw, what is my opinion on Israeli apartheid? That's a big question. As longtime viewers know, I tended to avoid the topic of Israel generally, mostly because I'm so conflicted on it. I was sort of raised in the United States. I sort of got Zionism with my mother's milk. I'm predisposed by nationality and long custom to support Israel. But yeah, that was a lot easier it was a lot easier to be a knee-jerk Israel supporter back in sort of 2000, 2001, where you had the second Intifada with bombs blowing up in Tel Aviv all the time. And even back then, of course, there'd be 100 Israelis would die and 1,000 Palestinians would die. But even back then, I saw, even back then, maybe it was problematic, but it wasn't for me as sort of an angry 23-year-old. And I was a huge Israel supporter. Now that we've got, 1,000 Palestinians dying and somebody burning down an Israeli farm, it's real hard to continue supporting Israel. It's a real problem, the Israeli apartheid, and I think it is absolutely fair to call it apartheid. People think that folks focus on Israel unfairly, but I'm responsible for Israel. That place is basically the 51st state. I dump, my government dumps what, $3 billion into that country every year, and NGOs and businesses I buy things from support Israel as well. So yeah, I think while there are certainly places in the world, India seems to be doing a race now. India and China seem to be racing now to see who can brutalize their Muslim populations more. Where things are much worse, I'm not responsible for what India or China does. I am responsible for what Israel does. And I don't know, I'm not 100%. I don't know if I'm there, but there's a possibility that my next project will be finally dealing with Israel Palestine, which is something that people have been asking for quite some time. So who knows? Next question. Hafiz Farouk asks, will you research the difference between Wahhabism and Salafism, a term hijacked by Wahhabis to give them legitimacy? Man, I have spent a lot of time researching, aspects of sort of the development of various terms. And I think Farouk is a newly born again a convert to the idea that Saudi Arabia has had a really, really pernicious influence, not just Salafism, really every aspect of Islam worldwide. Saudi Arabia has had tremendously damaging influence on just how it's developed over the past 70 years, because Saudi Arabia got really rich really quick, a long time before any other Muslim countries got rich. So it poured literally $1 trillion into pushing its quite demented version of Islam everywhere. So yeah, that's corrupted Salafism. That has corrupted freaking everything. One other project I'm considering, it's amazing all these projects I consider now that I've finished my British Empire book, which again, you could buy a copy of. There's a link in the description. So another topic I'm considering is sort of teasing out sort of the relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia, because it's a very weird, very fraught relationship. Sort of the Muslim Brotherhood coming out of Egypt. I mean, gosh, I think it dates back to the 20s or something like that. But when they were kicked out of, oh, well, thanks for the super chat from Anthony D'Angelo. $5 super chat. Thank you. That's very kind. You got a question, Anthony? I mean, thank you. When the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out of Egypt, I believe in the 50s or the 60s, they all went to Saudi Arabia and were a key part in shaping a lot of Saudi Arabia's ideas. And then, of course, the Saudis, the Muslim Brotherhood evolved and became a very different movement, and it's a different movement in every country where it's represented. And Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood now really hate each other, and there's just so much confusion and nuance and difference in how this all worked out. And there's so many U.S. commentators who are invested in making everything bad about Islam and politics in the Muslim world, making everything bad about that about the Muslim Brotherhood and not about Saudi Arabia. That it's kind of fascinating. So I was thinking another possible next project would be teasing out that sort of thing. But like as far as specifically defending the virtue of Salafism, that is not something that has struck me as an essential thing for me to do. So Hafiz Farouk is getting into the details of original Salafia, emphasizes reason and egalitarian roots of early Islam, pious predecessors. I can't really dive into that. I will say though that it is fascinating, and I remember this from writing my initial short book called "Everybody's Lying About Islam," which is not linked in the description, but you should check out. I remember doing the research for that. And it was really fascinating about how Islam at its roots, in its basic ideas, is about the fight against power, just as at its roots, most basically, Christianity can also be about the fight against power and about egalitarianism. What is it, the classic Jesus line, like it's easier for a camel to move through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven? It's a classic. But both of these religions can be used really in any way. So yeah, they can be used to defend entrenched power. They can be used to fight entrenched power. Okay, Logo Cool Extreme asks, why won't the Dems go after Trump for his Saudi ties? Should he be impeached for them? He should absolutely be impeached for them. He should be removed for them. He should be arrested for them. But Logo, you've asked for once a very easily answered question. The Dems won't go after Trump for his Saudi ties because the Dems are also um, purchased by Saudi Arabia. They're all complicit and are eager to be complicit when it's their turn to be president. So yeah, that's a pretty sadly that's a very easily answered question. The Democrats don't go after Trump for his sort of uh, disgusting bootlicking of the Saudis because they want to do it themselves. Now they'll be classier about it. They'll be more restrained about it. They won't be as embarrassing. That's the thing about Trump is he's really just a more extreme and dumber version of the status quo. He's not some rebellion. He's not some improvement. He's just a heightened version of the crap we were already seeing. Okay, Reed is good asks, why are Muslim a political topic and why are they in divide between Sunni and Shia? It's a very big question. Is you're asking about whether why is there a divide between Sunni and Shia? I mean, well, that's a specific historical question going back like what 1400 years. I think that, but I think you do get at something that's kind of interesting is sort of the questions of politics and religion and this, that, and the other thing. I think looking from the United States, we like to look at the Middle East and go, oh, look at all these crazy religious nutsos, and oh, these are all things that have been problems for 1,000 years. There's nothing we can do about it, and that's actually bullshit. Most of this stuff is political. If there really was an undying enmity between the Sunni and Shia, then all the Shia would be dead. There's a lot more Sunni than there are Shia. What really happens is that in different eras, from decade to decade or century to century, different things are emphasized. Once you start diving into it, you realize it's much, much more complex than just Sunni versus Shia. There's different varieties of Shia. There are, what, 4 different schools of Sunni Islam. And Sunni and Shia becomes a very serious issue that people have to worry about when it becomes politically important. When somebody who sees a way to get political power out of these old religious conflicts, they get dusted off and refreshed and become a new thing. When there's a political actor that has money and attention to put behind it. So yeah, this Sunni, Shia, I mean, they're all important. They're all fascinating, these divisions and sects and their historical significance. But I wouldn't let that confuse you to the point where you're like, oh, well, this is just this eternal nightmare that we can never deal with. No, it's all political, and it's all about what's been happening. I mean, the problems of the Middle East today sort of date back. Maybe some of them date back to imperialism. A lot of them date back to imperialism, colonialism over the past 150 years, but mostly they date back to the past 40 years. And, Sunni and Shia being a big deal just sort of comes, wasn't really a big deal before 1979 in the Iranian Revolution, where a bunch of folks in Iran saw some money to be made or some political power to be gained by, trumping up the Shia thing. And then, the Saudis had the response. So, yeah. Well, that's interesting. What was that? People asking questions. Logo Cool Extreme asks, don't you think your tweet celebrating the longevity of the U.S. empire on the grounds that India and China is cracking down on Muslims was in poor taste? Absolutely. So, as you may or may not be aware, I've made 2 videos sort of talking about this. One that was, I think, also probably in poor taste, talking about how the United States is, despite everything that the United States does to Islam, the United States is still Islam's best friend, because I think hopefully most of you are aware of what's happening in the Xinjiang province of China, probably the most horrible thing that's going on in the world right now. The Chinese are ethnically cleansing, if not yet outright genociding, a large Muslim minority. And in India, a country that since its founding in 1947 has been based on, at least legally, based on equality between religions or on being a secular state, is making serious steps towards the persecution of its massive Muslim minority. It's something somewhere between 150 and 200 million people. So yesterday I tweeted saying, yeah, and I think I don't think I was exactly celebrating. I think I said what's happening in India and China is horrific, but as a U.S. citizen who is concerned with the continuation of U.S. power, it's a bit of a relief because those kinds of actions that India and China are taking are signs of extraordinary weakness. And I'm somebody who believes that the story of the century is going to be a competition between the United States, my country, and China. And its actions in Xinjiang, as horrific as they are, indicate to me that they're not going to be as much of a competitor as I thought they were going to be. They're going to be, they are not yet ready for prime time. And is that in poor taste? Absolutely. We're talking about probably, we're talking about millions of people in China who are being repressed. There are 1 million people in concentration camps. In India, already 2 million people have been stripped of their citizenship in the Assam province, far to the, I was confused, as far to the east of the country. And in Kashmir, Kashmir's under martial law. The Muslim population's up there under martial law, and things are getting worse. It's horrible, horrible stuff. Is it in poor taste for me to look at that and go, oh, well, that's better for my team because those guys are assholes? Yes, that's in very poor taste. Should I apologize for it? Probably. But I think but I shouldn't apologize for it if I will probably continue to do so. I'll probably continue to make poor taste tweets like that. Maybe it's something I should think about further, and I should definitely endeavor to be more tasteful about that sort of thing because, yeah, it's a horrible, horrible, horrible things that are good for my country and my country's power. Because these horrible things that these countries are doing make them weak and make them look bad. Yeah. Yeah. It's now I'm getting depressed. So yes, absolutely, it was in poor taste. Yeah. Okay. Will Turkey look to increase its military involvement in Syria? Is what CG Ruiz asks. I really hope not. The thing is, and the thing that I find so frustrating is that Turkey at this point, I mean, he won. Erdogan got what he needed. Kurdistan is not going to happen. The Syrian government is back in the Kurdish territories. If the U.S. would finally just pull out, the Kurds will make some kind of deal with Assad that would help the war end and almost certainly preserve some kind of rights for the Kurds while also preserving the territorial integrity of Syria. So if Erdogan had sort of done that invasion, gotten the Syrian government back up to defend the Kurds, which he did do a couple months back, and then just sort of given up, and then just sort of and then just sort of like declared victory and withdrawn, I think he would have it would have been an incredible victory. Instead, he seems to be committed to this idea of like, even with the tiny parts of northern Syria that he's been able to take, trying to repopulate it with Syrian refugees, which is just, I mean, talk about another really bad idea that's going to make him look really bad. Yeah, nobody's that interested. Well, except for, of course, the folks in Idlib. Nobody's really that interested in moving to these safe zones. Where would you rather be? Some dusty place that was ethnically cleansed by the Kurds and is now being ethnically cleansed by the Turks in reverse. Would you rather be there? Or would you rather be in Istanbul? Trying to move your way up into the global middle class. Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's. I thought that Turkey could have just left and said, and Erdogan would have met all his goals, but that's apparently not what he wants to do, which is too bad for Turkey and too bad for the world and Syria. So we'll see. I mean, things will continue to develop. Um, Tariq Al Sulbi asks, "Are you not even going to discuss the major events in Iran or Iraq?" I did a live chat. I guess my last live chat about a month and a half ago was just talking generally about this sort of protest world that we're living in. For those who don't know, Iran is experiencing what is now, for sure, I believe, the um, largest street actions since 1979, since the Islamic regime came to power back in the 70s. So in 40 years, and a lot of people are, hopeful that this will lead to the fall of the regime. It could. It's a possibility. Of course, a lot of people were talking about this possibility 2 years ago, and I made a video about the Iran protests 2 years ago. I think if you go to the community tab um, uh, on my YouTube channel, there's a community tab. If you click on that and scroll down a bit, I talked about the Iranian protests that are happening now and why my video from 2 years ago still applies. I would be happy, even though it would be a victory for Donald Trump. I would be very happy if the Iranian regime fell. That would be good for everybody, I think. Of course, I mean, if the Iran theocratic regime falls and the response is like, the Republican Guard takes over in like a more secular sort of straightforwardly, fascistic Saddam Hussein type thing, would that be an improvement? Maybe. I don't know. But who knows? I'm not a big fan of instability. Even as I get older, I just become less and less of a fan of instability. I would have vastly preferred if, like, the Iran nuclear deal had been allowed to happen, and relationship would have improved with the U.S. and Iran and the rest of the world further. Because I believe that Iran actually already has the rudiments of a democratic, more representative system. And in the context of more openness to the world, more wealth in the country, I think that system would have gotten richer and more developed. Because that's what's always happened in human history. It's every successful regime change of the past 40 years has been when a place gets richer. The problem is if these protests are successful and we just get a fallen regime, we don't get a new, we don't get a sort of a new Republican Guard led place, or the magical conversion to Switzerland that the U.S. State Department seems to think might happen. If we just get chaos and destruction, if we get Iran, a country of 80 million, that goes down the Syria path, I think that's pretty damn horrific. And it could have been so much better if we just stuck with the Iran nuclear deal, and allowed that country to get rich and get sick of the theocrats on its own. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe the protests will be successful. Maybe maybe they won't. Maybe they'll be successful and it'll be worse. Maybe they'll be successful and it'll be better. The problem is, like, with mass protest stuff, and I hear you, like, we should all be talking a lot more about this mass protest stuff. But that's not just a problem for me. That's a problem for media, international media now generally. It's oh wow, thank you. Another super chat from Foxy Bay. Foxy Bay. It's a great name. The another problem for media generally covering protests. I did a live chat on this about a month and a half ago. Is like nobody can really adequately cover protest because the media just doesn't have the resources it once did. Like it's shocking how little coverage there is of the world. I lived in Istanbul for a number of years, and I would know, like, respectable news outlets, and their Middle East department would be based in Istanbul, and it would be like one 24-year-old, a very smart, very motivated, 24-year-old, but still like one 24-year-old. So, like, being able to engage with what's happening, well, obviously it's very difficult to engage with what's happening in Iran, because U.S. journalists are not so welcome. But in Iraq, where U.S. journalists, if they're not safe, should at least be able to hang out. they we just don't have the resources. We don't really know what's going on. We're sort of left with surfing social media and in limited time. So in Iraq, I mean, Iraq is, I mean, it's pretty horrible. I mean, there's hundreds dead now. If yeah, you know, if the United States hadn't already destroyed Iraq, it'd probably be trying to destroy Iraq. Hundreds dead. That's sort of that's why the U.S. killed 500,000 people in Syria, right? Because Assad killed a couple hundred people. So yeah, there are hundreds of people dead in Iraqi protests right now. I believe the prime minister has resigned, but sort of what that means to the oligarchy that runs Iraq, I just can't say. It is. I want to be hopeful about what's happening in Iraq, but I look at that and I just see it as just another in a long list of disasters that's happened because we chose to destroy that country back in 2003. So I don't know. All right. Sorry. Well, that's depressing. But you're right. You're absolutely right to criticize me for not covering Iraq protests more. Iran protests, we'll see. I'll make a video if something actually happens. Something absolutely is happening in Iran. It's big. It's a very big deal. But I just don't know what I can add to the conversation about it. I'd rather have added what I can. Please clarify. Tony Gogan asks, please clarify, are you inferring the Pensacola shooter acted at the behest of the Saudi government? He only represents the country because he's a citizen military personnel. No. Tony Gohagan, I am saying, as I talked about with my example with Okinawa, is that he absolutely represents the country. I'm not saying that the Saudi government, obviously the Saudi government didn't want him to go shoot a bunch of US soldiers. That is not what the Saudi government wanted in this instance. Of course not. I think there's a broader conversation about the way that Saudi Arabia educates people and educates people in its military, and the way that the Saudis see the world. I think there's a broader conversation about that. But no, I'm not claiming that the Saudi government told this guy to go kill people. I am absolutely saying that this attack is Saudi Arabia's responsibility, in a way that the 9/11, the 15 of 19 9/11 hijackers that were Saudi Arabian was not Saudi Arabia's responsibility, in a way that Khashoggi even isn't really Saudi Arabia's responsibility. Well, I mean, okay, that is Saudi Arabia's responsibility, but like these are US soldiers killed by, not by some death squad, paid for by some princeling, but by an officer in the Saudi military. So no, I am not saying that the Saudi government intended this guy to go murder people. But I'm saying that it is absolutely the responsibility of the Saudi government, and they can't get away with going, oh, he doesn't represent us. He represents you, just like every rapist in Okinawa represents the U.S. government, and the U.S. government is responsible for the actions of those U.S. soldiers in Okinawa. The Saudi government is deeply, deeply responsible for the actions of that Saudi officer on Friday. So, yeah. All right. Question. Logo Cool Extreme asks, will the U.S. lose Turkey and Pakistan to China while it gains Russia as an ally in the future Cold War with China? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think the U.S. is going to lose Turkey. I made a video about this a couple of weeks back. I think that the U.S.-Turkish relationship will survive, not because of any love between Washington, D.C. and Ankara, but because larger forces than Washington, D.C. and Ankara are now in the driver's seat in the U.S.-Turkish relationship. U.S. defense contractors are really, really fucking pissed off that Turkey's gone outside of their NATO monopoly to buy some stuff from Russia. But you know what? There's still a lot of McDonald's franchises in Turkey. There's still a lot of American factories in Turkey. I don't think that's a realistic thing. And Turkey and China, it's interesting. I was just looking at Twitter. Turks don't seem to like China much, surprisingly. I think it was, I don't think we're going to lose Turkey. I think Pakistan, China's welcome to Pakistan, frankly. I mean, that's maybe that's unfair to Pakistan. U.S. and Pakistan have a very long, very fraught relationship where there's been a lot of stabbing in the back of each other. I think that honestly, I think Pakistan stands to get a lot more out of a relationship with China than it does with the United States. The Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, is a huge topic of conversation. I was having lunch with a friend of mine who doesn't necessarily follow politics much, but he was like, "Oh, or rather, he like listens to NPR and just barely pays attention." And he's like, "Oh, this One Belt, One Road thing isn't China trying to take over the world?" So this is a big infrastructure project that China's doing everywhere. But what's interesting is that the main focus of it, there's a lot of, I mean, there's projects everywhere and it's important projects everywhere, ports everywhere. That's great. They're building a railway to Europe or whatever. And that's just kind of prestige building bullshit. The largest recipient of One Belt, One Road, BRI money by far is Pakistan. Because what China hopes to build in Pakistan is sort of an outlet to the West for China, which is necessary for defense security purposes and other stuff. But the long and short of it, it's also really useful for developing Western China, or rather Tibet and Xinjiang, places that would be easier for China to hold on to if there was large-scale economic development. And that's, frankly, it's great for Pakistan. Obviously, maybe they need to be careful not to get in sort of debt traps or whatever. But Pakistan's going to get a whole ton of new infrastructure, and hopefully will help that country, actually get some economic development, which would help it solve a lot of its problems. So yeah, I mean, I think Pakistan is perfectly capable of, paying lip service to a long alliance with the United States while also taking a lot of money from China. We're not yet to the point where people have to quite choose sides yet. I hope we don't get to that point. I think what's interesting. So I talk a lot about, and this might be what Logo might be referring to, that I think it's very natural for the Russia and the European Union to eventually work together, for Europe and Russia generally to work together. I don't necessarily know that that means that Europe plus Russia wants to work with the United States. I think that Europe gravitates towards Russia so it can actually become a real competitor, so we can have a tripolar world rather than a bipolar world between China and the United States. Yeah, I mean, I think that once the EU, I mean, who knows? But I think that once Europe does reconcile with Russia, I think it's probably going to be, I mean, it's still going to be formally allied with the United States. I think NATO is going to exist for fucking ever, unfortunately. I think it's not going to be quite as straightforward, once Russia's in the tent. Haji what asks, how do you evaluate the Iraqi protests? Schism in Shia politics, maybe. I haven't made enough of a study of it. Have not. I mean, I know that that's another problem with protests, is that so many people just try to impose their own narratives on it, when a lot of the time they're mostly just about economic deprivation. Like the reason that the world is sort of dissolving in protest over the past year is because the world economy, largely thanks to Trump's trade war, has been slowing down. I mean, that's at the root of it. And are there schisms in Shia politics? Of course. I mean, are some protesters really angry at Iran? Of course. Are some protesters really angry at the United States? Of course. There's like millions of people in the streets, and there could be a million different reasons why they're there. In 2013, I was in Turkey during the Gezi protests. It's obviously, it's funny. It was one of the most formative events in my life. That month that I spent getting tear gassed and attending protests and this, that, and the other thing. But obviously, it's Turkey, which is a developed country, like with police that are, I think, a lot more considerate of the protesters they were fighting than U.S. police would have been. So I wasn't ever really in danger, but I participated very fairly seriously about 2 or 3 times, where I actually went out and participated in protests in a big way, and I spent a month just being around it. being part of that, being on the ground there, I remember reading coverage of it, and those protests were actually very well covered because most of, and actually, I think to the point where the Turkish government was angry about it, because most of the sort of Middle East departments of most media organizations or at least back then, were based in Istanbul because it's a Muslim country where you can buy a drink. People like living there. So those were very, very well covered protests. And friends of mine who were journalists for very respectable outlets who were, experiencing the same things with me, or at least observing. I was probably participating a little more actively than they were, observing the same things that I was, knew the same details that I did. I would read their what they're reporting on the Gezi protests, and it would piss me off. Like these are my friends who saw the same things that I did, and what they reported just pissed me off because no, 1,000 word article, 10,000 million word article is going to truly encompass like what it's like being part of a protest. Like every individual is going to think different things matter. So that's another reason why I don't say too much about protest stuff unless it's got like a very clear goal, like get rid of this guy. So anyway, do I talk about Gezi all the goddamn time? Yeah, it's probably the most important thing that ever happened to me. So, well, second most important. Sobering up was the most important thing. Quitting drinking was the most important thing. Second most important thing was probably Gezi. So anyway, questions. Hafiz Farouk, that's a good question. Asks, do you think Chinese actions in Xinjiang are due to probable Wahhabization? I think that the Chinese government in Xinjiang, this is the Uyghurs that they're repressing, they put 1 million people in concentration camps. Their justification is absolutely Wahhabization. And it's because these Uyghurs were radicalizing. Were Uyghurs radicalizing? Probably, yeah. I mean, the Saudis poured $1 trillion into radicalizing Islam worldwide, and the Uyghurs, as a poor and marginalized group, were more vulnerable to that sort of thing. So sure, like were the Uyghurs radicalizing or adopting a radical, more radical view towards Islam? Absolutely. Does that justify concentration camps for 1 million fucking people? No. So while there may be elements of truth to that complaint from the Chinese, there were better ways to handle this. I mean, it's the second richest country in the world. These guys can do better than that. Yeah. And yeah, I think that a lot of the thing was by 2016, when this really stepped up, the Uyghurs had already been pretty thoroughly repressed. My understanding is that there were huge uprisings in Xinjiang in like 2009, maybe 2011, but that had been crushed. It had sort of a problem that was already handled. It was only in 2016, I believe, when sort of Trump was coming to power and the U.S.-Chinese relationship was sort of falling apart already, that the Chinese were like, okay, now let's just fucking go in and ethnically cleanse these motherfuckers. I mean, it is sick. Like they've got men in prison and then send Chinese soldiers to go live with their wives. Like anyway, it's So sure, yeah, there was some radicalization or Wahhabization, but not enough to justify what they're doing. Okay, questions. Questions. Have we got some questions? Hafiz Farouk asks, do you support Russia-style sanctions on China? What does Russia-style sanctions even mean? Like, I support, Russia-style sanctions. So you've noticed how there's these huge sanctions on Russia, yet everybody's still buying their oil and gas. So yeah, Russia-style sanctions, sure. Yeah, I think that the actual officials who are carrying out this fucking nightmare in Xinjiang, yeah, absolutely every one of them should be barred from traveling to the United States and Europe. I think if they've got bank accounts abroad, they should be seized. So yeah, that kind of targeted sanction, like sure, I don't think it'll really do anything, but it does send a message. But broader, like sanctioning China in general? Actually, maybe, but if that kind of action is taken, it needs to be an international action. It can't be the fucking U.S. OFAC. I think that this era when the United States just gets to sanction whoever it wants and then tells the rest of the world it has to sanction them too. I think that era is coming to an end within the next decade. It's actually an era that's only briefly existed. The U.S. used to try that during the Cold War, and they would get shot down. It's only in this unipolar moment that the U.S. has been able to set up this sort of secondary sanction regime where, the U.S. sanctions Iran, and anybody in the world who violates it gets, arrested or fined. That's something that's only existed for 10, 15 years and won't exist 10 to 15 years from now, mostly because of what Trump's been doing with the sort of unilateral destruction of Iran. Yeah, do I think there should be sanctions? If there were internationally agreed sanctions, like coming down from the UN that everybody decided to agree to, obviously it's not going to pass the Security Council, but if the General Assembly, agreed that there should be sanctions against China for the Uyghur thing, yeah, I think it would be completely merited. But I do not support the idea of the U.S. being like, oh yeah, we're going to sanction all of China now, and everybody has to agree with us, or we're going to start arresting your business people. No, I don't want that. But yeah, if we could get international consensus on sanctioning China for Xinjiang, definitely be for it. That's an interesting question. Oh, so many questions. Logo Cool Extreme asks, why is China so bad at making allies? No Opinion shared a tweet on which so many countries have a drastically reduced view of China. Yeah, so that's interesting. I think I might have retweeted that recently at Twitter on Rabo Law, which you can check out there, where China from 2002 to 2019, it varies from country to country. Some people have a very high opinion of China, but across a range of different countries from 2002 to 2019, it has all fallen. And that's a great question. Why is China so bad at making allies? The problem is that China is just so damn big and so damn close to so many countries, all of which kind of benefited from the 100 years of shame. China has some great way of talking. There's a slogan, the 100 years of humiliation from sort of the 1840s until with the Opium Wars, where the British sort of basically destroyed the place, up through 1949 when the Communist Party came to power. The Chinese government now, I think, less and less hidden, have an explicit idea around, we're going to go back to being the most powerful country in the world again. We're going to do it peacefully. We're going to do it slowly. We're going to do it quietly. It depends. I think Deng Xiaoping, really the founding father of modern China, I think, back in the 70s was like, oh, we're going to be careful. We're not going to step on anybody's toes. Xi Jinping, for some reason, wants to step on people's toes, which is very premature and I think very stupid. But it's the goal of China to go back to before the 1840s, where they absolutely dominated everybody in their neighborhood. And obviously, everybody in their neighborhood is against that idea because, they've had differing development paths that have taken them further along, and they don't want to have to go back to kowtowing to China for everything. So from Japan to Vietnam to Russia to India, there are just so many countries that believe themselves to be serious powers who shouldn't have to pay homage to China. And China, even if it's not, particularly aggressive about it, its explicit policy is, we're going to go back to the old times when everybody had to kowtow, at least in our region. And none of China's neighbors like that. So there you go. Also, China's, if you go back to the 80s, everybody hated Japan because they were becoming very rich and powerful. It's possible that as China's economy slows and as a lot of the manufacturing jobs move elsewhere, maybe China will get a little more popular again. Alternatively, as the economy slows, China could decide, oh wait, we're not just naturally gonna, be the most powerful country in the world again. I guess we have to get more aggressive, and I think that would end very poorly. But who knows? Hafiz Farouk asks, from a geostrategic perspective, do you think the USA is deliberately supporting Wahhabi petrodollar evangelism to keep Muslim nations regressive, divided, backward, and powerless? I don't think intentionally. I think we started supporting Wahhabi petrodollar evangelism because it was useful against the Soviets. We did that intentionally. And yes, back then, we hated Nasser, we hated the Syrian Baathists, we hated the Iraqi Baathists. We, back then, absolutely, we intentionally supported the weakness of Saudi Arabia and its just fundamentally weak ideology. Weak anti-modern ideology. We absolutely supported that in an attempt to keep the Arab world poor and dumb. Since then, well, since the Cold War, I don't think that's been an explicit goal, really. I think we more or less seriously would prefer it if countries in the Middle East were better run and more prosperous. But we have this inertia with Saudi Arabia that is the main bar to improving anything in the Middle East. So yeah, is it intentionally? It was absolutely intentional for up until the end of the Cold War. I don't know if anybody really even consciously thinks about it in those terms anymore. But that's absolutely the effect of our support for Saudi Arabia. Our support for Saudi Arabia keeps the Middle East poor and stupid, and violent and divided, no question. And it's not keeping Muslim nations. So that's interesting. So you can already see Saudi influence waning. It's still important in the politics of like Indonesia and Malaysia, but there are people who are like, God damn, that's really annoying. There are, as more and more Muslim countries become more and more wealthy and become wealthy on a stronger platform than petrodollars, Saudi Arabia's influence shrinks. So it still is absolutely incredibly damaging in Africa and the Middle East, but its ability to screw up Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey, Iran is diminishing. Bangladesh, Pakistan is diminishing. So, yeah. Local Cool Extreme asks, what's the deal with Pete Buttigieg going to Somaliland? What kind of CIA bullshit is this? It's a great question. I am not a big fan of Mayor Pete, I'll be honest. There's something about his smiling face that just bugs me. Also, I am not ready for a president who's younger than I am. Fuck that shit. There was a great, I was very, like, yeah, Dad, this kid's definitely CIA. It was definitely my first reaction to that Somaliland stuff. But actually, there was a great tweet thread. I think I retweeted it, where someone was pointed out, like, there's two things about this. Look, like, all this stuff that Mayor Pete did that was kind of grim looking, like, his trip to his like 6-month trip to Afghanistan, his doing stuff for McKinsey, like, it's all kind of sinister, like, military industrial complex, corporate dweeb stuff. But also, the dude was 27, like, he got out of college, he didn't know what to do. He like went through all the standard paths that tremendously overeducated and privileged people have open to them. It's not like you can really be blamed for that. However, the flip side of that is that, like, yeah, like 10 years ago, this guy was like writing a spreadsheet as a peon for like fucking McKinsey, like, it's like this guy wants to be president now. Like, it seems kind of silly to me, but yeah. Does somebody other than Hafiz Farouk and Logo Cool Extreme want to ask me a question? Is Ilhan Omar a double spy, a triple spy? No, man. Ilhan Omar is probably one of the best Congress people we have. Okay, Marlon Brian Munoz Nunez asks, Rob, what is your opinion about the lack of reaction by the public to the news about the cover-up by the U.S. military of the failures of the Afghan war? This is the Pentagon Papers again. Yeah, it's sad. I think it's the Post that has put out this reporting on the Afghan war, um, expecting it to be the Pentagon Papers. The thing is, when the Pentagon Papers came out, so through FOIA requests, Washington Post has done an incredible service. They basically, I only looked into it a little bit. My understanding is that 5 years ago, yeah, over the past 5, 10 years, there's been a uh, administration or agency or group set up to analyze in depth our failure in Afghanistan and the U.S. government. This stuff was, they wanted to keep it confidential, but because the Washington Post did a lot of FOIA requests and stuck to it adamantly, they got these reports, and these reports are pretty damning. And what the reports say is that really from like from 2002 on, we knew this was unwinnable. It's always been garbage. The generals and the politicians have always been lying to us about the possibility of doing anything in Afghanistan. It's all a sad joke. Back in the 60s, I believe it was, the Pentagon Papers, a similar thing was released about, or maybe it was the early 70s, about the war in Vietnam that was then ongoing. And it was like an atom bomb. Like it's a tremendously, one of the most significant journalistic things ever, finding those Pentagon Papers. Because back then, people really believed, like, oh, yeah, the US government thinks we can win in Vietnam and we're doing good things there. And then the Pentagon Papers came out. And it was like, no, nobody in the U.S. government thinks we're going to win, and everybody thinks it's crap, and it's all just a terrible waste of money. So the thing is, the people who paid attention to Afghanistan kind of already knew that. And the sad fact is that nobody, Afghanistan is just not a serious issue in U.S. politics, which is horrifying. Horrifying that we can have a 20-year war. I mean, it's a testament to how wealthy we are, but the fact that we can have a 20-year war where tens of thousands of Afghans have been dying, just continue to die. As long as U.S. soldiers aren't dying in large numbers, the U.S. public doesn't care, which is a real goddamn shame. Local Cool Extreme asks, is it bad that I've become incredibly pessimistic at any chance of Trump being impeached? Russiagate kind of broke me. I think he's definitely going to be impeached, but remember, like, impeachment is like he's being prosecuted. Like, the House decides to impeach Trump, and he will be impeached, and then the Senate decides whether or not to remove him. He will not be removed. But I think I still think, unless something dramatic has changed, I think it's still very likely he will be impeached, which will be very embarrassing to him. He will only be the third president to be impeached. So yeah, but yeah, he's not going to be removed. Yeah, that's something to definitely be pessimistic about. Do you think that Leo Dark Sam asks, do you think that Iran would be the greatest power in the Middle East right now if the U.S. hadn't hampered its potential for 40 years? That's a very interesting question. I think that the destiny of Iran is, or rather, the destiny of the Middle East is to go back to what it was for 500 years before the Europeans got there, which was a competition between Turkey and Iran. I think Turkey and Iran are the great powers of the Middle East. I think that for as long, I think probably, well, I mean, quite potentially for quite some time, Israel will be another part of that stool. What is an open question, and I think is a real possibility if Saudi Arabia can stop being the most powerful Arab country because it's garbage. Will there be an Arab representative in the Middle East? Will there be an Arab power in the Middle East? Egypt is the country that should be that, but it's been so comprehensively mismanaged for so long that it's just hot garbage. That's hot garbage is that's inappropriate. I apologize for that. But it is a desperately sad, mismanaged country, Egypt. So yeah, I mean, the Middle East will go back to being, without U.S. influence, Turkey and Iran will go back to being the main powers in the Middle East as they always had been. And Israel will be in that mix as well, and hopefully there'll be a powerful Arab country as well, because it's the Middle East. Arabs should have some power there. All right, that's that. RF Hoare asks, do you think the United States is going to invade Venezuela? I don't think so. Uh, could happen. It's a very stupid. That'd be a very stupid thing to do. Um, could happen, but I don't think it's necessarily likely. Yeah, I have not been looking at Venezuela recently. I was very worried. I mean, I think John Bolton, the national security advisor who was canned, wanted to invade Venezuela, would have been happy to invade Venezuela. I think there's a lot of Republican senators from Florida, like Marco Rubio, what's his name? Rick Scott. He's a senator now, right? Um, and they, because of the way that the politics of Florida works, talk a lot of shit about invading Venezuela, but I still don't think it's a real possibility. I think Trump has shown that he doesn't want to get into a war. And he doesn't want to get into a new war. And I just don't think Venezuela would go. I don't think Trump's dumb enough to do it. Could be wrong. Could be wrong. Um, the guy in Hebrew points out Egypt is rearming. Have you noticed? I mean, of course they're rearming. Like that. How do you think Sisi keeps the U.S. happy? He buys our garbage, buys our death garbage. Um, I don't know. The Egyptian military has failed to impress for decades, and running a regime as repressive as that is, I don't think is conducive to building a better military, frankly. So yeah, I'm not worried much about the Egyptian military. Um, Local Extreme asks, why won't the Dems cut off Hillary Clinton when she's such a liability to them? She just badmouths Sanders on Howard Stern about him not endorsing her fast enough. Yeah, fucking Hillary Clinton, man. The Clintons have been just such a disaster. It's worth pointing out that Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He's just running in the Democrat primary. Um, yeah, I there's a lot of Republicans fantasizing about the possibility that Hillary Clinton would try to run again. I really hope she's not that stupid. But because she lost, I don't think there would have been a Donald Trump if there would have been a President Trump if he was running against anybody else. So yeah, I do not like me. Do not like Hillary Clinton. I see we're discussing Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard's always just kind of struck me as a little nuts, which is a shame because her focus on regime change wars is absolutely vital. I want her to be in every Democratic debate until there are no more Democratic debates. But yeah, she's just crazy town. I haven't. It's interesting. There's been a real push recently against Modi, the Indian prime minister, and I've read a couple of these articles, and I think it's kind of valid. Modi is turning India from a place that very reliable democracy, very reliable force for peace in the world into a kind of a scary place. And I haven't really read, and I've heard a lot of people slur Tulsi for her relationships with Modi. I don't know. I don't know the details. Like, does she really have some kind of special relationship with Modi, or was she just pleasant to a head of state that is a U.S. ally? I don't know. But yeah, I think I will probably bother to do if she's still in the mix a month or two from now. I'll probably read all the Tulsi profiles and maybe watch her Joe Rogan interview and give a more serious read on Tulsi. But I doubt she's going to last long enough for that to happen. I think she's absolutely right about regime change wars. I think she's wrong about a lot of other stuff. I get this sense, this could be unfair, but I get the sense that like she thinks we should be fighting Muslims smarter, which is not really. It's like, yeah, if you like are really serious about fighting Islam and think that's a worthwhile thing to do, you're obviously not going to be a big fan of the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan either, because they're just disasters. The Taliban is going to be running that country when we leave, and yeah. So yeah, I sometimes do get the hunch this could be unfair when I look at Tulsi, that she actually thinks that the war on terror or persecuting Muslims is a good thing to do. We should just do a better job of it. And that's not, even though I think she has the right positions on many things, I do question whether it's whether it's for a good reason. Logo Cool Extreme says that Tulsi just greeted him at events. It's stupid. That's quite possible. And if that Tulsi relationship is being blown out of proportion just because she happens to be Hindu, then that's really fucked up. But if Tulsi is affiliated with what is it, the RSS, then that's really fucked up. So I don't know. Like I said, haven't done the necessary research. Um, hmm. It's an interesting question. Do you think Islamic Jihad and Hamas will become enemies? I think those are two forces that are powerful in Gaza. Hamas is the official government of Gaza, though much loathed by Israel, and Islamic Jihad is an even more extreme version in Gaza. Is that correct? Yeah, I don't know if they're going to become enemies. Haven't been doing the reading. Don't know. It's just, yeah, though I think my next project, it's possible, among many other things, it could be my next project, Israel Palestine. It's just kind of ridiculous. Like, am I really going to devote a ton of time and read a number of books about like fucking under 10 million people? Like, isn't that Israel and Palestine? I haven't even looked at the population figures recently, but yeah, isn't like Israel and Palestine together? Isn't it like 12 million people? Like, do I really have to fucking learn all that shit? Anyway. Um, I can't speak to the relationship between Islamic Jihad and Hamas at this point. Um, Jack Robbins says, I've heard a lot of Muslims talking anti-China due to the Uyghur issues. It's interesting, sure, there's a lot of Muslims, but not a lot of Muslim governments. The Saudis have been particularly abject in saying, yeah, sure, the ethnic cleansing of Uyghurs is a good thing to do. So, yeah. Ludwig asks, is Trump going to win the 2020 election? I really don't think so. I think in January I'll start doing 2020 vids, but I really don't think he's going to win. And I thought he would win in 2016. Was too I was too much of a coward to be as public about it. But yeah, I did think that he was going to win in 2016. I do not think he's going to win in 2020. I thought he was going to do poorly in 2018. He did poorly in 2018. Basically, he's not running against Hillary Clinton. Like Joe Biden would be the closest to Hillary Clinton, but even Joe Biden, like people don't hate Joe Biden. He's the same sort of establishment schmuck that Hillary Clinton was, but people don't hate him. People hate Donald Trump. People hated Hillary Clinton more than they hated Donald Trump. Or rather, yes, like she won the popular vote, but in the context of our system, enough people hated Clinton more than they hated Donald Trump, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about it. He won't be running against someone who's more hated than Donald Trump in 2020. And I think that should probably make the difference. I could be very wrong. I think we should work very hard to make sure that he is not the next president. If it's fucking, if it's Bernie Sanders with his crazy socialism, I'm all for it. If it's Joe Biden with his boring bankers Alzheimer's shtick, I'm all for it. Any Democrat. Um, Other than, yeah, if fucking Hillary Clinton runs again, I will do my damnedest to make sure she gets elected. But I think the only way that Donald Trump could get reelected would be if Hillary Clinton ran. So I would obviously be against that. Local Cool Extreme asks, why is no one going after Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar the same way as Kamala Harris when both of them had abysmal records with POC, people of color? Racism, obviously. Yeah. I have mixed feelings. So Kamala Harris was, I think, the Attorney General of California, right? Before she was a senator from California. And was the most spectacular flameout, one of the most spectacular. I think Beto was probably the most spectacular flameout. Well, actually, because Beto never really was doing well in the polls. Kamala Harris discontinued her run for the presidency over the past couple of weeks. Apparently, she had a very mismanaged campaign. But I think what Local Cool Extreme is pointing out is kind of fair. She got a lot of guff because she was a person of color who had made her career as a prosecutor and essentially a law enforcement official in California. So, in the context of her career, she put a lot of people in jail. She was the face and the support of a system that is really bad for people of color in this country, and in I think much more powerful ways than Mayor Pete or Amy Klobuchar. But I do think it is a bit unfair because I mean, fucking Biden, like you know, because he's ancient. Like, I mean, he was in the driver's seat in the Senate behind a lot of the birth of mass incarceration in the United States. So it is pretty unfair that Kamala Harris got more heat for that than all the white candidates who also had really bad criminal justice records. So I do think that's unfair. Yeah. So yeah, racism. But that said, I mean, Kamala was a cop. So that's actually kind of a hopeful shift for me that being a prosecutor is a history as a prosecutor is now like a liability in at least in democratic politics, which is very new because that used to be like that was a cool thing to do. Hmm. Do we have questions? Hafiz Farouk asks, how do you envision a post-Saudi, post-Wahhabi Saudi Arabia? Should Saudis even stay? Oh, no, I think the Saudi royal family obviously is not going to stay in Saudi Arabia. I think they're going to be in suburban Virginia and um, the southern coast of France, depending on how much money they've managed to spirit out. Yeah, the Saudi royal family does not have a future in Saudi Arabia. I think what's probably likely is some kind of caliphate deal, probably post Saudis. I think there will be a period of, sort of an Iran level um, sort of Islamic extremism for a while. However, if it's disavows sort of terrorist actions abroad, cool. It's not worse than the Saudis, which pay lip service to being anti-terrorism and still fund it everywhere. So yeah, like I think some kind of like more extreme Islamic approach that might be more egalitarian. Might actually be go back to that sort of anti-privilege and wealth Islam stuff. And then I think that would, unless so, if that happens, and then like I don't know, the U.S. or China decides to invade, then Saudi becomes a disastrous nightmare thing. If sort of a caliphate situation evolves in Saudi Arabia, and by which I mean to say like just an extreme sort of Muslim theocracy that's sort of anti-privilege like the Saudis, and it's unmolested if they agree not to fund any outside terrorism, and the U.S. and China don't invade, then I think they'd probably get sick of it after 10 years. That's the sad thing about Iran. Like, if Iran had just been allowed to do its stupid theocracy bullshit for like 15, 20 years, it would have given up. It was already trying to in the 90s with Khatami. But the U.S. wasn't, basically the U.S. hardliners worked with the Iranian hardliners to keep the fight going. And if the fight keeps going, then the Iranian hardliners can say, ooh, we have to protect you from the United States. So yeah, that's more or less what I would envision for the post Saudi Arabia. But yeah, if they can avoid some kind of war, then I think what's likely is sort of a pretty extreme Muslim government, followed 10 to 20 years later by a much less extreme Muslim government, followed hopefully by liberal democracy. We're all getting to Denmark, right? So yeah, that would be what I would envision for Saudi Arabia. Dankalus asks, is your book out in paperback edition? And yes, it is. There's a link in the description below to Avoiding the British Empire, a book that I recommend you all read. It is available both on the Amazon Kindle and in paperback form. So yeah, you can click on that link in the description. Okay. Umar Farouk asks, how likely do you think is NOPEC, the law that will bust oil cartels back from the dead? Well, I don't know. I think NOPEC's a bad idea just because like OPEC's already been busted. And the idea of internationally enforced competition law is kind of nuts to me. I don't think international law is really there. And I think for exactly those considerations, I don't think NOPEC is likely to get passed. Certainly, Donald Trump's not going to sign a NOPEC law against Saudi Arabia, but I don't think it's probably don't think it's going to make its way through the Senate. And I think, yeah, I think that's, it's like, why do you need to do a law against OPEC when it's already dead? Hmm? Local Cool Extreme asks, how have you dealt with cutting off alcohol so far? Have you gained weight? It's common for those cutting off alcohol. Well, I cut off alcohol 15 years ago. I haven't had a drink in 15 years. And when I first quit drinking, I lost like 50 pounds. That was back in 2004. Yeah. Because I was no longer drinking a case of beer a night, less calories. And finally, after 15 years of poor diet, I'm almost back to how much I weighed before I quit drinking. But yeah, no, gaining weight is not a problem when you quit drinking. Yeah. Victory as at MFF. Do you think it's possible to see the end of the Saudis in the coming year? How possible is this to happen? Coming year, no. I think I have always said by 2030. By 2030, the Saudis will be living under a very different system. Arabia will be living under a very different system. The Saudis will be in suburban Virginia or on the coast of France by 2030. And so when exactly that happens depends on a lot of things. It depends on when the next economic crash is. It depends on how quickly electric cars come online. So there's just all these factors. So it's really hard to judge. In the current position, no. I mean, the Saudis in the current position, I think, are probably fine in the current position. I think they've sort of stabilized to a degree. Their foreign reserves aren't diminished, well, unless they're lying about it. Their foreign reserves aren't diminishing as quickly as they were in the first years. The problem is there's a lot of stuff that they're sort of eating the seed corn. You know, they're eating a lot of the corn that they needed to save to plant for the next year. Like the way they've been abusing all the rich people in Saudi Arabia, the way that they're sort of playing with the public investment fund and Aramco now, sort of doing financial reconfiguring. The IPO that was supposed to get them $100 billion got them $25 billion. And a lot of that money is getting pissed away on Silicon Valley investments that some of them might be successful, some of them might not. So yeah, I think probably we need our next financial crash, which will be very bad for the Saudis. Something that nobody really talks about, maybe we should do a video about, is like the Saudis own a lot of shit. Like they own a lot of assets, they own a lot of stocks. The next financial crash, if stocks go down, housing prices in London, New York, a lot of the assets that they own that they might get financing for, like, becomes worth a lot less. And I think that a crunch becomes possible. So unless oil and gas being as cheap as it is right now, is that can just sort of keep on cycling. For electric cars to really get adopted and make oil completely unnecessary, not completely unnecessary, obviously, they'll still be pumping oil in Saudi Arabia long after Texas and Canada are finished. But how much will they be able to charge for is the question. So yeah, I mean, anyway, there are a lot of variables. I do not think Saudi Arabia will fall in 2020 or 2021. 2022, who knows? So yeah, my prediction was always by 2030. So at some point in the next 10 years. I don't think it'll be next year. So we are coming up on the 2-hour mark, and I've noticed that people don't tend to watch these things if they're over 2 hours after they've been produced. So I think reluctantly, after a good conversation, I'm gonna have to bid you adieu and say thank you kindly. My name is Robert Morris. If you're watching this for the first time, this is a YouTube channel every Tuesday, and I've been trying to do it twice a week now, but I only guarantee every Tuesday I put up a new video. You can check out the channel trailer if you haven't subscribed. That will give you a fuller picture. Please do subscribe if you have not. You can find me on Twitter at RoboLaw. I have ongoing conversations with many of the people you may recall from this live chat over there. So Twitter at RoboLaw, Instagram at The Golden Age. My branding is very inconsistent, but it's the way it is. I have written a very short book and a much more sizable book. I'd be really grateful if you check those out. The shorter book is called Everybody's Lying About Islam. It's sort of very much on the topic. Oh, well, look at this. Very much on the topic of what we've been discussing today, which is the U.S.-Saudi relationship. This sort of dives into the history. It's, I mean, it's about 2 years old right now, so it doesn't talk about MBS and Khashoggi and all that. But trust me, it was deeply screwed up long before MBS and Khashoggi and Aramco IPO dreams. So I'd recommend you check this out. Everybody's Lying About Islam, available on Amazon. And also, finally, after promising it for I guess this is the first live chat when I've finally had it done, Avoiding the British Empire, a 400-page book talking about the British Empire, how the United States is making the same mistakes that the British Empire did, and how it would be nice for the U.S. and the world if we could avoid the U.S. world system ending in an apocalyptic world war. So yeah, it's I think a very worthwhile thing. You should check it out. There's a link to this specifically in the description. Ding. Anyway, and I think that's all the pitching. We're continuing the series on avoiding the British Empire in the coming weeks. I think I'm finally going to be able to get some Tunisia videos done. And then in 2020, I promised after the 2016 election that I would not make any videos about the 2020 election until 2020. And 20 days from now, it will be 2020. So get excited for that. And please, if you're feeling generous in this year-end stuff, please consider chipping into my Patreon account. That's my crowdfunding thing, sort of like an ongoing Kickstarter. That's super important. That's where most of my money comes from. It sort of keeps me eating, allows me to write books, allows me to make videos, and I'm very grateful to the folks who are already supporting me there. I'm grateful to all of you for showing up, commenting, participating in discussions, liking, subscribing, commenting. It's all amazing. But it's the Patreon stuff that lets me eat. So if there's also a link to in the description below. So if you'd consider in this holiday season jumping on board there, I'd be very grateful. There are some benefits at different levels, and there will be more benefits coming, I think, in the next couple months as I start ramping up a funding, sort of a fundraising thing, because as much as I love this book and as proud as I am of it, it is not selling very well. So anyway, thank you all very much. That was apologies for all the plugging. Thank you for sticking around. 50 of you sat through all the plugging. Very grateful to all of you. The More Freedom Foundation is nothing without you folks. You guys keep me going. And I'm grateful that you show up. Okay, so now, if I can remember, there it is. All right, thank you very much, and we are out.